In this lesson, we'll look at how to construct a shading network that'll allow us to alter the placement of a certain texture using a NURBS curve as the controller. So let's go ahead and take a look at a fairly simple scene that we have set up, and this is just a NURBS plane that has just a grid file attached to it. Okay, and it's going to be very important that we use a NURBS surface for this particular exercise because the texture coordinates on a NURBS surface run from 0 to 1. So we're going to have to be able to actually gather that info for this exercise. So again, it's going to be important that we use a NURBS surface for this particular exercise. Okay, like I said in the intro, we're going to be using a NURBS curve to actually control the placement of this texture. So let's go ahead and create the curve that we're going to be using. Okay, so let's just go up to Create. Let's make an EP curve. Okay, and the size of this curve really doesn't matter. It can be any size you want, but you do want to go ahead and try and make it as straight as possible. That'll just make it easier to derive information from this once we actually start to use this to control this placement. Okay, you can go ahead and make it just 2 points, just a start and an end point. We can rebuild this curve later if we need to. Okay, let's go ahead and jump over to the hypershade, and in order to make this connection work, okay, this NURBS curve, we're actually going to have to use a node that's not available to us within the hypershade. The node that we need is called the point on curve info. Okay, if you look through here, nowhere will you find the point on curve info node. Doesn't exist in the hypershade. Okay, why is that? The reason is that there's a handful of nodes within Maya that can only be accessed by actually manually creating them here in the MEL command line. So the point on curve info just happens to be one of those nodes. So we're going to have to use a little bit of MEL to be able to actually create this particular node that we need. And again, it's called point on curve info. So whenever you're using MEL to manually create a node, you need to start off with create node, okay, and create node, and then space, and then you type in whatever node you want to create. In this case, point on curve info. Okay, just one word, and then an uppercase letter wherever you actually would normally see a word break. So point on curve info, hit enter, and if everything goes correctly, you should see this little result come back to you, that it created a node called point on curve info 1. Okay, and if you look, you may or may not be able to see this node anywhere in your hypershade. Okay, so where did this node go? How can we get to it? If you don't see it show up in your hypershade, you may actually need to go over to your outliner and find it there. Okay, but if you look, it's not in our outliner either. Well, there's actually a lot more in this outliner than what you can normally see. If you right-click in your outliner and unclick this Show DAG Objects, okay, uncheck that, you now see a lot more stuff come into your scene. Okay, and if you look closely through this, one of them should be this point on curve info that we just created. Okay, so if we go ahead and let's just go back to the hypershade, we should be able to just middle click and drag this point on curve info back into the hypershade. Okay, so now we can work on it. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this up. Okay, so we've got the point on curve info. Now let's go ahead and select this node, shift select this curve down in your perspective view, and let's take a look at the input connections. Okay, and what that'll do is go ahead and give us both the curve shape and the point on curve info to be able to work with. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this curve shape. Let's shift, middle click, and drag this onto the point on curve info. And what we want to do is connect the world space of this curve into the input curve of this point on curve info. And that's basically telling the point on curve info, okay, get information from this curve. That's basically what we just did. Okay, let's go ahead and add to this a sampler info node. Okay, and let's connect this sampler info into the point on curve info. So again, shift, middle click to pull up the connection editor. And let's connect the vCoord of this sampler info into the parameter of this point on curve info. Okay, so again, just to kind of break this down, we've got the point on curve info saying, okay, get info from this curve. We use the vCoord to say, okay, get v-coordinate information from this curve. Okay, let's add another node to this. This is going to be the vector product. Okay, the vector product is going to be used to actually gather data about the distance between these different points on this curve, which is going to be very important for actually controlling the placement of this texture. So again, vector product is going to be gathering info on these different points. Okay, so again with this vector product, shift, middle click. Okay, actually it's going to go the other way. We're going to connect the point on curve into the vector product. Okay, so the point on curve, from the you'll find what we need to connect underneath the result. Okay, and we're going to connect the tangent of this point on curve info into input 1 of the vector product. Okay, so again, it's basically just going to be looking at the tangency of these different points, okay, and then feeding that into whatever shading network that we make. Okay, I think this will make a lot more sense here in just a moment once we get this finally connected. Okay, let's go ahead and go into the vector product. Okay, we're going to want to make sure that this operation, okay, and that's set to dot product, which is what we want. Okay, let's take this input 2 and just give it something more than 0. Let's say 1. 1, 1, and 1. So these are just x, y, and z coordinates. Okay. Now let's go ahead and take this grid. Okay, let's go ahead and let's minimize this. Take a look at the input connections. Okay, and what we want to be able to do is access the place 2D texture of this grid. Okay, so if we look at this, we've got, again, the curve shape and the sampler info that are both plugging into the point on curve and then going out to a vector product, which again is going to be measuring the tangency between the different points on this curve. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this vector product connected to the place texture of this grid. So let's shift, middle click, and let's connect the output X of this vector product into the rotate frame of this 2D texture. Okay, really doesn't look like much has happened, but if you take a look at this, again, if we reload this, the input connections, you can see that there is now a connection. Okay, so this is the basic shading network that we're going to be using. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at some further adjustments that we'll need to make to really make this whole thing work.